hop in.
Sven just pinged me. He's having to update Zoom.
Always.
So just while we're waiting for Sven's Zoom to update and while everyone's filtering in, welcome everybody. We'll just go through a couple of housekeeping things. Obviously, if you want to ask a question, we do have the Q&A feature, so please make sure you use that to ask your questions. And if you do want to, if someone's already asked your question and you want to make sure it gets answered, give it an upvote and it'll shoot it to the top of the list. So thank you all very much for joining. And Liam, Zach, do you want to introduce yourselves very quickly and give us a quick overview of your involvement with Istio?
I'll let Zach go first.
No, I was going to wait for Liam. Hey, y'all. So I'm Zach, one of the early engineers on Istio, wrote Istio up and running. And then these days, I watch a lot of other people work on the project, unfortunately. So I do a lot to kind of help companies adopt Istio, but I'm not quite so hands-on as I once was.
Right, so I'm Liam. I'm a maintainer on Istio. I've been working on Istio since even before it was announced, so quite a while back. Mostly my work nowadays is building interesting stuff on top of Istio and the relevant maintainer duties.
Yep, and we had a Sven and we lost him. So we'll give another minute or two to come back. Do please, if y'all have questions, go ahead and start to populate them in the Q&A there.
And he's back.
Hey, Sven, welcome, welcome. No audio yet, maybe.
All right, questions are already starting to come in.
Yep. And do try and use the Q&A. People can fill in the Q&A, right? Try and use the Q&A over chat. That way other people can vote and we have a little bit easier tracking there. It just makes it easier for us to make sure that we actually answer everything.
Absolutely.
Hey, Sven, are you there? You're with us? No.
All right, should we get rolling with some questions? And Sven, you can introduce yourself when.
All right, I just got audio working.
Hey, welcome.
Excellent, welcome.
Super glad to have you. Do you mind giving your a quick intro for yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Sven. Sorry about the Zoom issues. I'm one of the co-founders of Istio, and I work at Google. And yeah, just on Istio technical oversight committee and steering committee, and kind of doing all the things to make the project keep moving forward.
Actually, I think we talked about Sven was who I talked to when I wanted to join the project way back when.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I convinced Zach to join.
I think we can call it that. Sure. Yeah.
So
I remember it as me coming to Sven and saying, "I want to leave my team."
Well, yeah, there was that part.
And yours.
It wasn't very hard to convince.
So we're an incredibly good company and we've got some brilliant questions coming in. So what I'm going to do as we go forward is I'm going to ask the question out loud, and then whichever one of you feels like you want to take it, please do. Otherwise, I will just nominate you and we'll see how that goes. So we'll get going. So the questions that are coming in so far, the first one is, Istio is quite heavy. Any percentage of overhead, or what percentage of overhead are we talking? It's quite specific.
Yeah. Sven, do you know the numbers offhand for recent runs? I haven't looked at the performance testing just offhand.
I haven't looked at them yet.
So I guess there's a couple things that contribute to this, right? So the biggest thing is the Istio control plane itself in modern times actually has gotten quite a few improvements to its resource utilization, in particular with the introduction of the Sidecar API resource that's really reduced things. So one, I need to find, and maybe if somebody can type quickly in the background, they can dig it up. I think Carl Stoney gave a phenomenal set of tweets with pretty detailed information about the before and after resource utilization of their Istio installation in recent versions. Roughly speaking, I believe that for them now, and again, I'm putting words in Carl's mouth, but I'll find the Twitter thread to back this up. I believe that actually Istio is a net cost savings for them now because it is reducing their cross-cluster traffic. So that doesn't answer your overhead, but that gives you a ballpark for what it costs to run versus maybe when you have a large set of applications that are doing kind of sophisticated things on the cloud, including multi-region, multi-zonal deployments. Istio is not a dominant cost there. And in fact, actually, the overhead can be small enough that you can get some savings there if you're using things like locality prioritized routing and similar. So in terms of percentage, it's hard to say just in general. And partly it's going to depend on what your, how heavy the utilization of your apps themselves are. I don't know, Sven, do you have maybe some?
Yeah, so I think that, so you kind of brought up one of the key points, which is that the control plane itself, the Istio control plane has gotten really slim, especially if you use Sidecar API. It's very, very small and can be very cheap. I think the other part is the data plane, right? So the data plane overhead has continued to drop. I know it's still more than I'd like, but I think we're in the, a couple milliseconds range of overhead. Generally speaking, obviously it depends on the application and on configuration and a bunch of other stuff. I think we have numbers on the istio.io website on some of this, but I'll have to dig them up.
We do. And so in general, if you're trying to look for this kind of information, Istio does publish performance testing results for every single release. And there is a page where that lives on the Istio site. We'll try and link it in chat. I don't remember it offhand, but I think it's like istio.io/performance or something like that.
I found it. I'm going to respond in text on the question.
Yeah, please. So in general, cheaper than it's been till date, but yes, there is still some non-zero cost there.
All right, so next question. When Envoy is started as a sidecar on one of the HTTP service that I start as a main service checks for the port availability, since Envoy is already up and running, it responds to the query and my HTTP service assumes that the port is already in use and it fails. How do I overcome this issue?
That one I'm actually not sure about offhand. So I assume that this is your application is written to be smart to try and correctly allocate ports for itself and not conflict with existing ports, right? Is what I assume there.
This must be running outside of kube, right? This must be, because in kube it's specified per container, so they're separate containers. So I'm assuming this is running outside of kube.
Yeah, I don't know if we actually cover that case gracefully today. Then, if you can provide some more details either in the chat or that might help. But offhand, in Kubernetes, I'm not actually sure if there's an easy solution for this kind of a problem. Sven, have you seen anything similar?
So
on your side?
I haven't. It sounds like the application is starting up, and before it binds to the port, checking if the port is in use, and because Envoy is doing IP tables interception, maybe it's intercepting that request and it's saying, yeah, I got that. So I mean, simple thing would be just turn that off, right? Stop checking. Just hard coded to go for the port and not check. Otherwise, I think if you absolutely need that, I would say basically come file an issue on Istio's GitHub to give more details on your exact use case, and we can see if we can help.
All right, great. And next question, when will users be able to control all pods from a single control plane?
All pods in what? So today with a single cluster, yes, you can already. If we're talking about multi-cluster deployments, there are a couple of different deployment topologies for Istio that work. And one of the newer ones that I think IBM has been kind of the main driver behind is this idea of central Istio-D, which would be one Istio deployment that would control the sidecars in a bunch of different clusters.
That's actually now called external Istio-D.
Oh, is it now external Istio-D, not central Istio-D? Sorry, the name changed too fast.
Changed last week. You got to get on that.
Oh man, getting behind.
So behind
in
the
general,
times,
there's so I just to add like a little bit. So like yes, that is technically possible. I will say that from Tetrate's perspective, we don't recommend that any of our customers do that because we put a strong emphasis on aligning the failure domains in your system with the components of these deployments. And so in particular, what we say is you probably want one Istio control plane per Kubernetes cluster, because that Kubernetes cluster represents multiple different failure domains in your system. a network failure domain, a compute failure domain, and probably most importantly, it represents a configuration domain. And so if we can align Istio with those, that means that hopefully we can make that whole unit fail as a unit. That gives us better properties for our system as a whole and makes it easier to reason about.
Yeah, and I'll add that we designed the way that the control planes can work to sort of spread the, go across the whole spectrum, right? So you can run a single one across an entire huge mesh, or you can run one per cluster as sort of the most fine-grained. Actually, you can run multiple per cluster if you really need to, because we have different revisions even. I think that there's probably a sweet spot in the middle somewhere, depending on your needs for availability versus your willingness to pay the cost and keep them all up to date and configured and sort of, you know, best practice is definitely not to have a single one because of the single failure domain, but then, you know, you could have regional, you could have per cluster. There's lots of options.
Yeah, and you have to trade off. And basically one of the fundamental trade-off you're making here is runtime availability versus the administration that you have to do outside of the system.
Yeah.
All right, and a question here. What is the biggest Istio production cluster you are aware of? And is it multi-tenant?
I'm trying to think. So just to be totally candid, a lot of this is covered with NDAs and things like that, right? So we can't speak to specific numbers or anything like that. So I can really only reference publicly available things that other folks have talked about. So there, in Sven, you may actually have some more up-to-date info than me. I think one of the larger ones that we regularly talk about is AutoTrader. I think they've been quite public about theirs, and I believe they're in the scale of several thousand pods across a couple different clusters in their Istio deployment, I believe. I'm trying to Sven, maybe let me give it a little thought to see what things I can say.
Yeah, I can't name names, but I can say that we have, yes, in terms of nodes, many thousands of nodes in a single cluster, and then also multi-cluster meshes that span multiple many thousand node clusters. I think I've also seen in the tens of thousands of pods in a single mesh being used. Effectively, those are indeed multi-tenant. Multi-tenant in the sense that multi-tenant within a company, let's say. So different teams have different namespaces and use them.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one thing I want to touch on is in the wild, I have never seen a hard multi-tenant Istio, nor I think could you actually build a hard multi-tenant Istio today. Certainly that would be a very challenging prospect. But we regularly see soft multi-tenant Istio deployments where that tenancy would be like a line of business, right? So for example, several of the companies we work with, they have a platform team that is operating Istio on behalf of the entire organization, but they have maybe 10 different lines of business that are consuming this platform, right? And so each of those can even share underlying clusters, underlying Istio control planes, things like that. But the important bit for them is isolation of configuration change and that kind of thing. And so that we do see out in the wild for sure. I would not do, I mean, in general, I think hard multi-tenancy in a Kubernetes cluster is not a thing that is done or is feasible.
If you want hard multi-tenancy, use different clusters.
Yeah.
Use different meshes. Okay.
Yep.
All right, and the question here, we have run into issues where the sidecar shuts down while the container has still open network connections. Is there a certain config we should be using to eliminate this from occurring?
So I can take this one because I've worked on some of this. So there is a configuration in the API somewhere, and I'll get you a link to it, that basically tells Envoy to drain connections for a certain amount of time. So what will happen is, you know, in a Kubernetes world, you're going to cycle a deployment or whatever. The pod gets sig term. It will, this configuration basically defines the time period in which Envoy will no longer accept new connections, but it will allow you to continue existing connections and allow them to finish up. So depending on what your requirements are, you can set that to, I think the default might be 30 seconds. I can't remember off the top of my head if this has changed, but at some point it does have to shut those connections down. So if you are, you know, if you have connections that are lasting for 5 minutes, then you can set it to 5 minutes. But you know, at some point it does have to cut them off, right?
Yep. I think specifically the flag is shutdown grace period. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the same one that applies when new configuration is pushed to Envoy as well, right? Which is the same fundamental behavior. We have to stop accepting new on this config chain and let it train. And I think in general, the rule of thumb that you should do, or a rule of thumb that would be safe always, would be to have that grace period be like double or at least 50% longer than your connection TTL. And that is assuming that you have pretty short-lived connections.
And if you're in a Kubernetes world, again, you need to make sure that the graceful termination duration, or whatever the flag is in Kubernetes, is obviously longer than that, because otherwise the container is just going to get shot.
Yeah, because those are all layered. Those things all layer and don't really interact with each other, right? But they're all just basically stopwatches that get started to turn down everything. So make sure that they're consecutive or they contain each other.
All right, so I think this is a follow-up to a question that we asked that was asked earlier, and with more information, that all of the post requests on the portal fail with a 403 when using Istio as an ingress gateway with TLS terminate. When I use the node port, everything works fine. Is there anything special that I need to do to get post requests to work?
I think I would need more information on exactly.
Yeah, so that 403 is a permission error, right?
Yeah.
And so that, because that's a forbidden. So that actually likely means that there's some other policy in place that's preventing your traffic, whether that's like an auth-z policy in Istio or something else. We would have to see some config to be able to answer that kind of, for some of the more detailed questions like that, maybe one of the better places to go would be discuss.istio.io. In there, you can actually post a discussion link with some code in it that we can compare. But there, if you're getting some 403s, that should not be related to termination. In fact, actually, if you're getting a response code that's a 403, that means the TLS termination is happening okay, because that's an application level error. If you were getting like a TLS error, that would be you would get a TCP level error.
Okay, and another question I think about utilization here, but how about the Istio container inside every pod? How many resources would that use?
So that's gonna, and that was really what Sven was talking about with respect to data plane resource utilization, right? So that's gonna heavily depend again on those sidecar resources that are published in the mesh, because that sidecar API resource scopes the configuration that goes to any given envoy. And so that will largely impact the memory footprint of that sidecar that is deployed. In general, and Sven, you can keep me honest here too, in general, that we typically see for like a normal deployment that is using sidecar API resources, something on the order of like tens of megabytes of configuration for a given envoy, right? When we talk about then Sven already talked about latency. It's on the order of a few milliseconds per hop. I forget, again, I don't have the exact P50 and P99 to give you offhand, but it's on the order of, I think, like, it's between like 1 and 3 milliseconds. That's posted on the performance page. And then finally, there's the CPU utilization there. And again, this number is out of date. Sven, you may know more recent ones, but the old rule of thumb was for one vCPU, Envoy can do roughly 3,000 requests per second.
Yeah, I think that's improved, but I don't have the, we have to go.
Yeah, that has gotten better. That's like a year-old number at least. So that has gotten better. So hopefully that helps give you some, again, like percentages are relative, right? So it's hard to give you specific numbers, but those should at least give you some ballparks for you to be able to start to size yourself. And a lot of those numbers, again, are posted on the performance page as well, I believe.
All right, so we'll dive right into the next one. What are the biggest challenges with running Istio in a bare metal K8s deployment, and what are some of the strategies to make it easier and better?
Jace, asking like good questions.
Yeah. So I'll say in general, we have not done bare metal K8s deployments. So I can't speak to the kind of the specific intricacies there. I can speak to things like us extending the mesh into VMs and pure bare metal deployments, in which case the primary problems are around bootstrapping of identity today, for the most part. But I can't speak specifically to K8s on bare metal. In my mind, that's not too different than like we have plenty of customers that are running K8s in their in their VM deployments, for example, and similar. But at the end of the day, as long as it's a conforming Kubernetes cluster, then it's not really so different, right?
Yeah,
there might be some specifics for how you do node ports versus not, and how you handle some ingresses. But in that way, I can maybe speak to ingresses, but otherwise it should be fairly normal Kubernetes.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Kubernetes is abstracting a lot of this away. Istio just relies on the Kubernetes pieces for most of that. So it's, most of the problem is going to be just getting Kubernetes clusters up and running, and the networking specifically that Zach's talking about, right? Getting node port,
yeah, so like
ingress and all that stuff working, but not.
Yeah, so like
should be fine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, like a specific set of problems that we've seen fairly regularly in on-prem Kubernetes deployments is the fact that external load balancers are hard to make work, right? And so if that's the kind of stuff that you're talking about, there's a bunch of different techniques, but it largely comes down to how you actually run the L3 network that your clusters are sitting atop, right? And we've seen everything. I've seen people that have super sophisticated setups where they're assigning external IPs to Kubernetes services, and they're using BGP to make that work. And they just have traffic arrive at pods. Or I've seen them, sitting at the other end of the spectrum is, the Kubernetes cluster sit behind an F5 and it's pretty static. But it really depends on what the actual underlying network infrastructure that you're on-prem or that your bare metal cluster is sitting atop. So I don't know if Jason, if you can add more color there, if there's ask a follow-up.
All right, so this next question is pretty specific to a GitHub issue that for 1.7. So it appears this person has run into an issue where they're getting a 503 service unavailable when they're sending requests across clusters. And they're asking if there's a fix in progress for that.
I will assign it to someone that works on multi-cluster right now, and we'll get back to you.
Excellent. All right, so next question then. Can you share a little bit about how to archive multi-cloud with Istio? For example, communication between AWS and Google Cloud.
Yeah, so I assume that's achieved. Again, this comes down to how you want to set up your overall network topology across the two clouds. In general, there's a couple different patterns. Istio's website actually publishes a couple of, at least two of those patterns, the replicated control plane pattern, and then what's the right name for it? Sven, shared, or
shared. Although we're changing terminology all the time, but
that terminology is in flight. If you go and look at the Istio installation tasks or guides, there is two of them, and they lay out both of these topologies. And they have slight differences in what you can and can't do. Generally speaking, assuming that you have disparate L3 networks, that you don't have a single L3 network that bridges both of your clouds, which is the common case, then the way that we recommend that you set up the replicated control plane topology, which would basically force traffic between your clusters through ingresses. And then how you expose those ingresses is up to the network topology that you want to build, right? So you can use a VPN across your two clouds, and as long as those ingress IP addresses for your Kubernetes clusters are exposed over that VPN connection, then it'll flow just normally. In general, the theme is Istio will work atop the L3 network that you give it, and it comes down to how you configure it. In general, the easiest way to do that configuration is to publish the ingresses of a remote cluster, plus the set of services that are behind that ingress. And we have special configuration in the mesh config that does that.
Yeah. And there are projects in flight to make all this a lot easier, by the way. So right now it's pretty manual. You have to kind of set it up all yourself. There are projects coming in 1.8, Istio 1.8 timeframe to make a lot of this simpler and easier.
Yep. Because there's a fixed set of, once you decide how you're going to publish it around, there's a fixed set of data that needs to get propagated across the different clusters. And so, hey, we can start to automate the propagation of that data. And just as a meta point, the way to think about this, and we picked Gateway as the name kind of on purpose, think about this as how you're building a L3 network, right? The general philosophy when we build an IP network is know where your local things are, and then know where the gateway is for the next hop. Right, and it's the same general philosophy here. where, in my local cluster, I know where everything is and I can route it directly. And when I need to go remote, I know where the entry point into the remote is, and then I'll let it handle it from there. And that's in contrast to like a scheme where everything knows about everything, and you have like n-squared update problems, right? In particular, as endpoints of services change, that has to get propagated all over the place. You want to keep that local.
Want to talk about trust as well?
Is that in the follow-up question, or
there's
just
no
trust?
follow-up question, but like trust across multi-cluster, right?
Yeah. So that's the other big thing that we run into a lot, right? So in demo Istio deployments, right, Istio is creating its own root of trust. So each cluster is an island. One of the biggest pieces of advice that we give organizations, especially if you're looking at a multi-cloud setup, you need to root Istio in your existing PKI. That way you can allow seamless cross-communication. And in general, you need all of your Istio deployments to be speaking out of the same root of trust. That way you have trivial cross-communication. Or you can issue separate roots of trust for each Istio, but you need to populate those CA bundles everywhere. And so that becomes quite a bit of work. And so in general, what we recommend people do is create an intermediate signing certificate out of your existing PKI for each individual cluster, for each individual Istio deployment. And that sits, for most people, at the right trade-off between manageability. There's not so many certs that they can't manage those signing certs. But it also gives you good enough revocation, right? If I need to go revoke, I can take out an entire cluster without taking out the entire mesh. And so that, in our experience, has been a good trade-off for production use cases.
Sounds like there's a good piece of written work that could follow that question up, Zach, at some point.
There might, yeah, we do.
Might well be.
Yeah, we have this actually gets asked a lot. You may guess from my canned answer there. That this is a pretty commonly asked question. We are actually working on a blog post that kind of explains this a little bit in terms of the cert chains and stuff. So it's pretty clear and graphical how that works.
Stay tuned. So we'll go to the next question. We see this error randomly when we're installing Istio on new clusters. I'm not going to read the error message out. If I see differing versions listed as when this is affixed on GitHub, do you know which version actually fixed this?
So the error was failure to set up the CA certs, mount the CA certs.
I'm going to go in general with the latest version that you see posted as having fixed it on GitHub, because by definition of it being attached to later ones, it means we didn't do it on the earlier ones. But I don't know for that one specifically, and that could just actually be an underlying timing or race condition in your Kubernetes cluster, because in different providers, volume mounts can be interesting. But I don't know specifically. If you have like an issue to link in the repo, that would be helpful.
Yeah, it might also be that like the fix was backported to earlier releases, which might be why it's showing up as fixed in multiple. So,
yep.
Like maybe it's fixed in all of them, but it's also good practice to try to be on the latest if you can, just because there's a lot of fixes, security fixes, performance fixes, other fixes in the latest releases. So it's good to be on the latest anyway.
Yeah, in general, when you see a point release, a lot of the times that is a security thing, right? It's either a security thing or a breaking bug. Right, we don't cut. It is not a normal part of our process to cut point releases just at a regular cadence. We do it on demand.
All right, brilliant. And we've got, this one's been split into two. So the first part is, when using Egress Gateway for passing through TCP traffic for different external endpoints, different port need to be opened on Egress Gateway. Is there any other way that the different endpoints can be served from the same port on the Egress Gateway?
So yes, there is, but it comes down to if you can control SNI in your application is the very brief answer. Effectively, so this boils down to how does Istio identify traffic that's coming in? There's in general for TCP traffic, we only have the IP address and the port, right? So we have that tuple, and so that's all that we have to work with. Therefore, we need separate ports to be able to identify separate external services easily. If you set SNI if you use TLS to talk to the egress gateway, and you set SNI on that outbound, then we can use that as well, and that would actually give you kind of an L7, not quite, but that would at least give us a name that we can back into a service to be able to do connection level load balancing out.
Yeah, I wonder if that's actually I haven't checked if that's easily set up today with Egress gateways. You can set up like
It is
multiple
not.
things on the same port and rely on TLS S9 to do
So we've actually hit this with some of our customers, and the answer today is it's a giant pain in the butt, and you need a very specific incantation of configuration on the client side and on the egress gateway side to make it work gracefully. And I'll point out, this gets even more complicated. One of the more common use cases for an egress gateway is for credential exchange. I want an external credential, like a mutual TLS cert for an external service, to live on my egress gateway and not on my pods. And so if you have this identity mapping where you have your egress gateway that is using certs locally to do outbound connections, there's an additional security concern that you have here if you have different certs. So you need to be really careful how you configure the setup and how you configure your OPC policies to avoid your egress gateway being a confused entity.
All right, and I'm not sure if you covered this in your answers, but for egress gateway, can there be a pass-through cluster?
Yes. I believe, yeah, and that's a install time configuration, I believe. There's just a global config that says allow unknown or not. And if you allow unknown, that will work even at the egress.
Excellent. So for those attending, please keep your questions coming in. We've got 30 minutes left to where you've got experts at your disposal to get your issues assigned, to get questions answered. You know, this is a multi-service platform, so we'll do our best. But I think one thing that would be really great to cover is we had mention of what was going to come through 1.8 and improving user experience. Is there any hints that you can give us as to what else we could expect in the next release?
I was going to mention that the egress gateway, I believe there's a couple items on the roadmap and networking for improving egress. So I think that's an area we're investing in making better. There's a lot of improvements we're putting into virtual machine support. So that's like my current focus right now, is making sure that that gets a lot smoother. It got a little bit better in 1.7, but it's going to get a whole lot better in 1.8. We're trying to make it much simpler and also actually clean up how Istio deals with things and make more of a unification between what we do with containers and VMs.
Yeah. And hopefully 1.8 is where we actually get to, we've been doing a bunch of pre-work in 1.6, 1.7. Hopefully in 1.8, we can actually start to kind of reap the benefit a lot of that.
Yeah. Multi-cluster is also getting a brand new terminology and a brand new installation guide in 1.8. We're working on that for a couple releases. The external SDOD thing is going to get more stable and more usable. Those are just off the top of my head. There's a whole long list. We're actually in the technical oversight committee meetings for Istio, which happen every Friday at 10 a.m. and it's open to the public. We go through the roadmaps, and we've been going through the roadmaps for each Istio working group. I think there's maybe 2 more left for this week, but then last week's we went through a couple, and I think that was recorded. So if people are interested, there's sort of roadmaps published for each working group, and there's a list of all the things they're trying to get done for 1.8.
And those are those all openly available in the Google Drive?
Yeah, all that's openly available. The Google Drive, you do have to join a Google group, but joining it is just go click a button to join. There's no one has to approve it or anything, so anyone can just go look at our docs. Yeah.
And in the instructions for that and all the details and everything are in the Istio community repo, which is github.com/istio/community.
Yep. Yeah.
And there's the whole guide, the TOC schedule, all the how to join, where the drive is, all that stuff. Cool. Other questions, comments, concerns, rebuttals? Tell us how we were wrong.
All welcome here.
Ask anything. Any questions are welcome.
Yeah, they've all been Istio only.
All right, so we've got another question here. We have a use case where we want to use group cache on a Go services, which is needed. Sorry, my English is atrocious today. Which is needed to set up a set of IP other than peers in the same type. How can we get a set of IP address based on service type?
Yeah. In general, in general, Istio hides this. The way that you would achieve this in Kubernetes is by making your group cache services a stateful set. And that would ensure that each of them has a persistent DNS name and IP address that they can use for discovery and routing. And then Istio will set up the listeners correctly so that when your application is talking to instances of that service via the fixed IP address, we'll do the correct stats reporting, we'll do the correct OTC and all that. But there's not a native query that just says, hey, given this service, give me the set of endpoints that Istio will answer. Certainly, you could ask the Kube API to give you the endpoints of a service.
So to answer that question, not at all. Just because it's mentioning group cache. I've had in my mind for a long time that I want to do something like group cache, but implemented in the sidecar, where you could get the sidecar could actually just be a group cache for everyone. This is it's not really Istio related, but it's something that's actually would be possible with the WebAssembly and the ability to kind of deploy code into places. But
another thing actually that'd be cool that has fallen off. I don't know where it is today, but way back when Mandar had another Google Istio dev had a design for via services, which was the idea that the mesh that you could list from A to B via C. And the mesh would transparently force that traffic into that intermediate service without either application knowing, where you could do policy or other things. One use case for that could even be like caching. I don't know where that I think that kind of fell off. There's a lot of technical challenges there, obviously, in implementing something like that.
But I think that's actually coming back a little bit. So we're looking at, people mostly see, again, if people have actually questions, there's a new question, but I'll riff on this for a little bit. The design of Istio right now in Kubernetes is, we inject it into the pod, right? We add another container into the pod and run it there. There's CNI to kind of try to take this out, but there's other efforts underway to try to make that more formal and make it easier to run the proxy outside of the pod, and to make it more feel like it's sort of part of the networking infrastructure that you get, rather than kind of this hacked in sidecar thing. The way that we're looking at doing this actually is very like the BS stuff, where it's, you want to be able to say, hey, on this connection to this thing, like inject these basically network functions, right? And one of those network functions would be the Envoy sidecar that does all this stuff, or its equivalent functionality. But you could then inject other things in there as well. And, it makes the system more flexible, but it's a lot of work in the underlying infrastructure layers. It's not, it's mostly not Istio work. It's like Kubernetes work.
And there is some interesting stuff, like some of the technical blockers I know for the VIA things would be addressed with some of the encapsulation that we're pursuing. So like one of the longer term things that's happening in Istio is we're investigating, and I think actually already not past investigating and have agreed to start to basically encapsulate most traffic as H2, even if it's TCP. And that gives us a common place to be able to put metadata regardless of protocol, and lets us do a whole bunch of really interesting and pretty snazzy stuff that is independent of protocol. And it just, in general, gives us a side channel by which to pass data across Istio components that the application doesn't have to be aware of. Cool.
All right. So in 1.7, the Mixer adapter APIs are getting depreciated and moved to Envoy. How is this progressing, and is there any update?
Yeah, so we are working on removing Mixer. I think it has already been deleted from 1.8 code base.
Yes,
so Mixer,
rip Mixer.
Yeah, rest in peace. Mixer is gone. So the progress is that in 1.8 it'll be gone. There's a lot of work ongoing to make sure that sort of anyone that was using Mixer for things that they can't yet will be met by 1.8. So, that you can extend it using WebAssembly. I think we're still working on making that a process things still work even through WebAssembly instead. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. But yeah, Mixer's gone in 1.8.
All right, and so
I've seen the PRs to remove the code and approved several of them. So yeah.
Yeah, no, Doug Reed, who so Mixer was the original piece of Istio that I worked on. Doug Reed sent over the PRs to me with we reminisce together. Sad times. We had such high hopes for Mixer, it just never did translate.
So we've got a question here from Archie. Are there any techniques to secure traffic from pod to Envoy, or is it Kubernetes world?
Yep. Hey, welcome. Good to see you. Yeah, the best way to do this is to use a domain socket, right? So a domain socket is guaranteed to be local. It's guaranteed that it's not going to actually hit the network. You have, or at least you can do a better job of guaranteeing it's not going to hit the network. So yeah, having basically, if you write your applications to communicate over a domain socket, but set the host header for their requests, and you configure Envoy to listen to that domain socket, which you can do with the Sidecar API resource, then your application traffic will not hit the network between Envoy and the application itself. And so in general, for kind of more sensitive environments, we do this, and we recommend that our customers do it. The other big use case that this addresses is Istio requires that your application speak clear text, right? If your application is originating HTTPS today, the mesh doesn't provide very much value. And so the Istio asks, hey, use HTTP instead. That's obviously a big problem if you require, for example, because of regulatory compliance, if you're required to have encryption in transit, what happens if this workload gets deployed without a sidecar? Right, and so this is a very common security model question that we have to address for security teams. And the domain socket provides a good answer for that as well, which is the application, if it's deployed without a sidecar, it talks to a domain socket and that doesn't go anywhere. Therefore, you don't have clear text on the network. And as far as I'm aware, that's basically the only way to do it. You could, in theory, set up TLS between the sidecar and the application, but that's like a lot of performance cost for a small benefit when you could just use a domain socket and you get a lot better performance. Domain sockets are cool. You should use them.
That's a highlight. That's just what we're going to call this when we put it on YouTube later. Next question is, should we set up database services inside the Istio cluster, or should we use it as an external service such as RDS Elastic Cache from AWS or similar on Google Cloud?
I don't know if y'all, I've been talking about if y'all want to take it, but I certainly have opinions.
I mean, my short answer would be like, it's, it depends on you, right? Like if you want to manage the database inside the cluster, go for it and use Istio to manage your encryption and all the other great things Istio does. If you want to use a managed service, use that, right? I think Istio can kind of do some stuff with managed services today, using Egress gateways or using some of the external services, but some of that might get better, but there's not much Istio does for you when you're using an external service.
This is kind of orthogonal to Istio, I would say, right? This is really a question of, do I want to use a managed service or not? Whatever you pick, Istio will be able to work with that, right? So if you deploy your Redis, for example, inside your Istio cluster, that's fine. You can even put sidecars on the Redis if you want. But that'll be like a stateful set service. And there will be the commensurate trade-offs in Istio for that stateful set service. In particular, you're going to want to make sure that you have sidecar API rules that make sure that stateful set doesn't go everywhere in the mesh, because stateful sets are when endpoints change in a stateful set, it is more expensive for Istio to update because of the way that we have to program Istio Envoy to handle them versus other types of services. So that's just one caveat to know. But in general, it just is a modeling question, right? Is it going to be a stateful set? Cool, Istio handles that in Kubernetes. If it's going to be an external service, that's also fine. But you just need to model that external service, right? That'll be a service entry that points to your RDS hosting or equivalent.
All right, and another question. Are there any good examples to use Istio for chaos as a chaos engineering tool to inject faults and delays into nodes or pods? They saw someone in Envoy, like using docs and samples, on how to leverage Istio for chaos testing.
I don't know if we actually have, I don't think that there exist open source tools for using Istio's APIs to do chaos testing yet. I don't think. But certainly you could. I don't know of examples that sit around that are easy. I do know of examples of fault injection. I don't know of examples of the full end-to-end setup that you might want.
This sounds like a good blog post. That's one to put on.
Yep.
Carl Stoney was actually tweeting about. So in AutoTrader, they do have. They basically built their own fault injection tooling on top that they allow their application developers to use. So he's on the platform team at AutoTrader, and they basically built their own, which just exposes the standard Envoy fault injection stuff via the Istio APIs. They just have a nice shiny UI to do that.
Yep. Yeah, No, I mean, it's a phenomenal use case for it. I strongly recommend it. One of the big things too is if you start to encounter, like if you have recorded historic outages because of a specific set of conditions that you can emulate with a pulp injection, that's great. But yeah, today I think that there is not in open source a lot of the machinery around the Kubernetes cluster and around running and executing chaos tests via Istio that you would really want to make that super robust. Certainly you could build like specific bespoke test cases out of it today.
I like the use of the Q&A as a chat window. That's great.
Yes.
Is there anybody, like obviously we've just mentioned AutoTrader, but is there anybody else who they could go and look at how they're doing resiliency testing or chaos testing openly that we could point them in the direction of?
That's what I was trying to remember. So like I know Carl has talked about it in Twitter. I don't know of other blog posts offhand. And by the way, if you're doing Istio things, you should definitely give Carl a Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you should give Carl Stoney's Twitter a follow. I'll link it. Because he does give very nice, regularly he gives, kind of firsthand accounts of their experience and in general, it's a pretty interesting thing to see.
Absolutely. We've got 10 minutes left and we've had some really great questions so far. So if you've got a last minute burning question that we can answer, I'm using the royal we quite clearly. But if there is any questions that you would like to be answered, please send them in the next few minutes. In the meantime, I've got a question, which was in relation to something that I saw that Sriram had posted on Twitter not so long ago with regards to shipping a DNS resolver built into every Envoy sidecar with auto IP allocation. What's going to be the outcome of that? Like, what's that going to mean for users who stop abusing their F5s?
So I can talk a little bit about where I've been approaching that problem, and I think it's mostly, this is an issue for like VM integration. You don't really need any of that stuff if you're on Kubernetes because kubedns is built in and it just works.
Well, caveat there. I'll touch on that in a second.
Yeah,
There's a specific set of cases.
Yeah. Okay. So so for VMs specifically, one of the big problems is that it's really dependent on your what operating system you're using, what image, what version, right? Like it's different depending on your particular VM. So there's no like one size fits all for setting up DNS to route correctly to other services in the mesh. So basically we're using the kubedns as the DNS resolver for the mesh. VMs don't natively integrate with that. You have to go set it up. That's very painful. If instead the Envoy is just intercepting DNS queries and giving you back, like checking if it's for something in the mesh, if it knows about it, it gives you back an IP address, then you don't have to do any of that setup. You just drop it onto the VM and it just works. So that's what the kind of goal is here, is just to simplify the onboarding, make it much easier and seamless.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, basically that we crutch on right. So like Istio doesn't do DNS. So service entries that you create in Istio are not resolvable by an application, right? And so that's fine in Kubernetes because in general in Kubernetes services and service entries are one-to-one. Therefore, Kubernetes makes sure that you have DNS. So the one case that the caveat is, what if I want like a fake name in my mesh that an application could route, that I could direct traffic to, but it resolves to some other thing, right? Yeah. And the answer is like natively, it doesn't resolve. And so this comes up in the mesh on Kubernetes in the mesh use case for cross-cluster traffic. And that's why you see the whole .global suffix in our examples and that stuff is around is to kind of resolve some of these things where we need to be able to create fake names even inside of Kubernetes that are resolvable, but are not resolvable via kubedns. That's like a point problem that gets way worse when you get into VMs, right? Exactly like Sven described.
Yeah, and on multi-cluster specifically, we're actually working with the Kubernetes community on the multi-cluster services that actually will resolve at least that part and get rid of the need for .global. So we were actually joking about it the other day because basically we're renaming .global to clusterset.local. Really, it's the same use case and the same thing. We worked really hard to get rid of .global and now we're adding it back in a different way. But
and to be fair, .global is always I I was the one that asked Shurem to add the .global, and that was literally for a demo for DockerCon, because I wanted to be able to make it really, really obvious what was local and what was not. So there's the fun legacy decision for why we've had to unravel .global specifically.
Yeah, but we have a path forward towards a cleaner solution there. But yeah, you're right. If you want to register names that Kubernetes doesn't know about, and Kubernetes does have very specific requirements, right? It's like it's a name and a namespace. If you want to just throw in extra names using service entries, you have to, historically, you'd have to do with the DNS yourself. So we do have a lot of users that are actually doing this, right? They have their own DNS server. They get rid of kubedns. They don't use it. They do their own registration. That's a lot of work. If you do it, then everything is great, but it's a lot of work. And this new stuff will let us just do that for you. Right? You don't have to put.
And to link this back to one of the earlier questions and answers as well, you only actually need DNS if your application has to resolve DNS. So we mentioned earlier that you could have your application talk to a Unix domain socket and set host headers. And if you did that, then Envoy would be able to route it correctly. But if you think about that one, your application would never need to do DNS resolution in that case. And so that is another way in which you could bypass some of the DNS requirements there. And that would be one way in which you basically entirely delegate all service discovery to Istio.
All right, so I have a question for you, Zach. What if I want to do the Unix domain socket thing, but I'm not using HTTP, I'm using TCP?
Yep, so that it's the same, you just have to make sure that you have VIPs. For domain, actually, no, there you have to do unique ports, sorry, for domain socket. So you're back to that egress proxy case that we got asked about. You're back to there. So basically you have to have a different socket per TCP.
Yeah, I think it's different socket per service that you want to talk to.
Yeah, so TCP, it doesn't scale well. If you did do, maybe we should look at S9 there. But in general, yeah, TCP.
Or there could be a tunneling, but then the application would need to do it. Yeah, anyway.
That case gets complicated. But certainly for HTTP, in that case, you can elide DNS, the need for DNS.
All right, and just very quickly as well, Carl Stoney says hello. And also, as we head into kind of the final stretch, are there any hints and tips in Istio upgrade? Anything that I need to know before I undergo an upgrade?
So with every release, we publish fairly detailed upgrade notes. So read those. Please read those. We've had a lot of problems with people not reading those. So I'd read those. And then the other thing I would say is we have a model for doing upgrades where it's like multi-control plane now, where it's not an in-place upgrade. I would strongly recommend using that. So you can spin up, basically because Istio control plane is so cheap that we were talking about earlier in this call, you can just spin up a new version of the control plane and then migrate, even one pod at a time over to the new control plane and sort of verify that it works, right? So there's a lot more safety in those type of upgrades than in an in-place one.
And that's brand new as of 1.7. I think, or 1.6 maybe had a test version of it.
Yeah, it was like alpha dev.
Yeah, but that is now, that's one of the bigger things in 1.7 is that is now a little bit better supported.
All right, so always read the docs is what I've taken away from this.
Well, at least read the update notes. Read the upgrade notes.
Yeah.
And the release notes. We put a lot of effort into those, so yeah, please read them.
At the very least. Okay, so this question is, our use case is of an on-premises deployment of Istio. We are exploring using direct BGP advertisements on Istio Ingress Gateway and Egress Gateway. Are there any recommendations for tools for integration in this area?
We do actually have some, I do know firsthand of Istio deployments that do this. I do not know what tools they use to manage. In particular, what you have to manage there is the link between Kube API and your BGP, right? So you need, as Ingress pods get moved around or scheduled on different physical ports, you need to keep that updated with your underlying network stack. I don't know what controllers they use to do that. We might be able to hunt around after the fact and reply back, but I don't know what tooling they use for that today. That's where that gets into the kind of the how's your bare metal Kubernetes actually running. So sorry, I don't have great answers there. It does work, like Istio doesn't care about that. It's great. Istio will happily operate on that network. Don't have advice for which tool, unfortunately. All right,
Okay, and what is the current Istio release schedule? Every quarter?
Yeah, we release every quarter. The next release is currently scheduled for kind of mid-December, so we're trying to figure out exactly when that's going to be. We're trying to move it a little bit earlier, so we have a little buffer. But yeah, we release once a quarter. I think we've been on schedule or pretty close to it for the last 3 or 4 releases. I forget there was one that was like horrible. I don't remember which one that was. Zach, do you remember which one was the painful release that took us so long? But
you don't remember that one?
I don't remember which number.
08. 08 into 1.0.
I thought there was a more recent one, but
well, I mean, 1.2 was also hell.
Yeah.
08 to 1.2 were all special and uniquely miserable in their own ways.
Yeah, I think like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 have all been pretty solid.
Well, that's because 1.2 was so bad that we finally got the process down and like finally staffed the engineering to drive the process to make it not horrendous. Yeah. Because 8 through that had been so bad. Oh, I'm surprised nobody's asked, hey, so the next Istio version is 1.9. That means 2.0 is next, right?
That means what's next?
No, Kubernetes has ruined it, right? Kube's on like 1.18 or something, right?
Yep.
Yeah, no, we are going to 1.10. Yes.
Yeah, 1.10. Because that's how software is numbered.
It was supposed to match the year and month. I don't know.
Liam, did you have an answer for the Helm install question?
Yeah, so the question that's actually open is the follow-up, because I asked a follow-up question and that answered the question. The original question is like, how do you recommend users manage both installing Istio and Istio configuration itself? And as with every answer, it kind of depends. Helm was kind of one that you mentioned. If you're using Helm to deploy, put it this way, I wouldn't take what we've done with the operator, strip it out, and then use Helm instead, because that's just going to be painful because that part's not as well tested. In terms of when you're installing the operator, you have to install the operator, and then you have the custom resource. Now you could, if you need some templating in there, change that around. Kind of depends on your needs. In terms of Istio configuration itself, and all of this really depends on like, who are you using Helm? Are you trying to use Helm to make it simpler for your developers to interact with it, right? In which case you probably only want to give a subset of values configurable via Helm that makes sense to the developers. Or are you doing it for yourself? Like, Helm's just a tool. You can use Helm, you can use Customize. There's nothing really Istio specific as long as you're using an operator on that decision. It's more kind of, what does your organization use to deploy like general Kubes applications, for instance? And really, I would just follow that because you'll be familiar with the tooling.
All right, great. And that wraps us up to an hour pretty much on the dot. So I want to say thank you to our attendees and for having such lively questions and enabling such a brilliant conversation. And I'd like to say thank you to you three as well for joining and covering off so much in only an hour. So much appreciated. And for those of you who are in attendance, obviously, as we've heard, the notes are openly available in Google Drive. There is always the Istio community Slack channel there, which I know is very active and a lot of people respond and are very helpful in there. And also, if there's anything that you've heard today that you want to learn more about, feel free to get in touch with us at learn@tetrate.io as well. So you've got a broad number of ways to get in touch and find out more about Istio.
Any plugs on your side?
What were you telling me?
Yeah.
Want to plug anything? No, I'm not here to plug my products. Come on. Yeah, no, I encourage people to join the community. We're actually, very actively trying to expand our community. We were GitHub's 4th largest growing open source project last year. We want to keep that trend going. We want to keep expanding and keep getting more users, more developers, more customers, more everything, more partners, right? More vendors. So if you're interested in Istio, come join us, join the conversation, definitely.
Actually, on that note, maybe one of the big things that's happening right now, that's like going on like right now, is nominations for the steering committee's charter was approved and updated and expanded now to more seats. One of the aspects of that is that there are 4 community seats that are being that nominations are open for right now, and they're open through Saturday. So talking about another area of involvement. If y'all are, or if you're at a company that is already involved, definitely think about that as a valuable way to be able to contribute.
Yes, and it only took us 1.5 years to finalize that charter, but
yes,
got it done.
We got it, and it's good. And I think it's a really good direction for the overall steering. Cool. Alrighty, thank y'all.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.